Any length of time, you know that we spent some time talking about how major institutions have lost their first love. We've talked, for example, about how many of the initial universities in this country were founded on biblical principles and have left those long ago. We've sometimes talked about even some of those Bible institutes, hundreds of them formed in the 19th century. Today, really only two standing strong, a Moody Bible Institute and the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, which is Biola. And we've also noticed from time to time organizations that have a founder with biblical principles. Then when someone takes over, they sort of lose their perspective and maybe begin to drift. And that's why we're going to be talking about this book today, Mission Drift: The Unspoken Crisis Facing Leaders, Charities, and Churches. Fascinating book. And as I told my producer, Catherine, one of the reasons I wanted to put it on the air is just to tell the VeggieTales story, maybe also to tell the story of the Pew Charitable Trust, Andrew Carnegie's influence on the secularization of the universities. There's some great stories in here, but also some warnings to those of us in leadership. And if you're a pastor, if you're heading up of a Christian organization, maybe you're a Bible teacher, or just a concerned Christian investing in various churches and ministries, you need to pay attention today as we talk about this book, Mission Drift. We have copies of the book available. We are making it available today at the Point of View store. We have an article about it, and we also have a trailer. It lasts for about a minute and a half. Something we encourage you to watch. Maybe then click on the share button, put it on your Facebook page. And I think as we go through this interview today, you will see why we think this is a very significant book and why we put it in our Point of View store. The co-author of this book is Chris Horst. He wrote that with Peter Greer. And Chris has served for a number of years at Hope International, currently serves as the Vice President of Development there. Also serves on the boards of a number of other organizations, the Denver Institute for Faith and Work, the Colorado Microfinance Alliance. He is a graduate of Taylor University in Indiana, has an MBA from Bakke Graduate University. And so, Chris, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
I'm so happy to be with you, Kerby. Thanks for having me.
We certainly want to spend some time getting into some of the very important stories, but early on, your co-author, Peter, tells, I think, a really powerful story where he is interacting with a senior executive of a global oil and gas corporation, and it looked like that would provide a very significant grant, and as somebody who's the Vice President of Development, you know how important money is. But then they made the statement, which I've heard so many times working with Christian organizations, and that is we can't fund organizations that are overtly faith-based. And then he was faced, as so many of us have been faced over the years, to say, well, do I stay true to my mission or do I water down my Christianity? And I think that and other stories are some of the reasons that you and Peter wrote the book. True?
Absolutely. And the complexities that leaders of faith-based organizations face cannot be overstated. It is incredibly difficult to lead a faithful, gospel-centered organization in our current culture. The pressures are, and one of the arguments we make in the book is that the pressures are always going to be taking you away from your mission. And leaders that we found through our research that do the best job of this are ones who are able to safeguard and work really hard to build the right sort of boundaries around their mission so that they protect what matters most. And that situation with the donor in Texas was exactly as you described and really became the genesis for this book project. Our board, praise God, had the courage to say, even though this is a lot of money that we're leaving on the table and a lot of money that could really do a lot of good, they felt like trading away the thing that was most valuable would cost the organization long-term, no matter the short-term benefit. So we had to decline this funding, but when you have mouths to feed and salaries to pay and work that you believe God's calling you to do, it can be really difficult to look that sort of donation in the face and say, we're sorry, but we're just not willing to compromise.
Now, I started out by maybe looking at American history. Before we get into some of the Christian ministries, we can see how this has played out. As we look at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, going all the way down to Brown, Dartmouth, UPenn, things like that. Many of these, almost all of the major institutions in the early centuries of this country were formed with a Christian conviction, and that actually students had to agree with the founding mission of that organization. I think it'd be fair to say now that you would be hard put to find any of those institutions that are even all that favorable to Christianity. So this sort of spiritual entropy, if you will, if I can use that term, the tendency to move from spiritual to secular, is something that we have seen even outside of the church. We've seen it in major institutions over the years, and I think those of us that are in Christian organizations and churches should learn a vicarious lesson, don't you think?
Absolutely. Harvard's story is so fascinating because their founding mission statement was to be that all their students would be plainly instructed and consider well that the main end of your life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ. And when you read about the founding of Harvard in the great book Dying of the Light, you'll see that a few of the folks at Harvard started to see early on the secularization happening. So they branched off to create a faithful Christian university, and they launched Yale University. And we know Yale today, similarly to Harvard, it's not that they're bad places, but they are not carrying the same rich heritage that they once used to. And I've been interested recently to track with the stories of coming out of both Harvard and Dartmouth about this surge in really, really sad sexual abuse that's taking place on campus. And just this week, the Dartmouth president had an address about this surge in extreme behavior on the campuses, and they're grasping at straws. They're looking at task forces and rule books to try and counteract some of the behaviors they're seeing on campus. But the reality is, without a clear and coherent moral core by which these institutions are guided, these sorts of behaviors shouldn't be surprising. And it's really sad because you read the story of Dartmouth and Harvard's founding, and the founders would be just absolutely appalled about what's happening on these campuses today. So I think that the lessons we can learn from that are clarion and important for us to be examining as we think about the organizations we are both supporting and leading ourselves today.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Chris Horst. He is the co-author of the book, Mission Drift, and it is a book published by Bethany House. You can look for it in your local bookstore, but if you have difficulty finding it, we also have posted it today on our Point of View store. And we're going to come back and talk about some of the other founders that would be appalled at what has happened to their Christian organizations, to their philanthropic organizations, that some have remained true to their attempts to really begin to advance the gospel and to make a profound biblical difference in society, while others have drifted far away from that, and some of the lessons perhaps that we can learn to make sure that that does not happen here. We're also going to talk about what has happened in some of the seminaries, because we've seen some seminaries that have drifted away, but we have, especially if I can use for an example the Southern Baptist Convention, another number of seminaries that have come back to their true mission, but not without a great deal of conflict. So we're going to talk about that as well. It's a fascinating book covering lots of different issues, and if you would like to know more about it, we have information about it on our website, Mission Drift. We'll continue our conversation about it right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
America's stated military policy has always been to minimize civilian casualties. Last year, the Obama administration even went further by establishing a policy that required near certainty that there would be no civilian casualties before an airstrike takes place. Over the last few months, the U.S. has called upon Israel to follow the same policy. That is why you heard comments from the administration that the Israeli army was not doing enough. As someone traveling to Israel, I appreciate the fact that Israel did so much in the last few months to eliminate some of the threats from Hamas. Alan Dershowitz was on my radio program recently to talk about his new book on the terror tunnels, the case for Israel's just war against Hamas. He also wrote about some of this in his op-ed on the education of a wartime president. Both were a sobering reminder about how Hamas fires rockets from densely populated areas and how they built these terror tunnels so that they could attack Israeli citizens at will. You know, Alan Dershowitz also explained that the Obama administration has begun to exempt itself from its near certainty standard in its fight against ISIS. While it is commendable that the administration wanted to try to meet the higher standard during an attack, the reality in the field suggests that that may not be possible. When Israel is fighting Hamas, they are fully aware that terrorists are using civilians as human shields. They put the Israeli army in a difficult position. Either they attack a legitimate target or they avoid taking out a terrorist threat. The U.S. military sometimes faces a similar dilemma when fighting ISIS fighters embedded in villages. Perhaps the best way to understand how this dilemma plays out is to remember the phrase by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who said, "We use missiles to protect our people. They use people to protect their missiles." We should do all we can to avoid civilian casualties, but we also need to understand the circumstances on the ground. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Chris Horst as we continue talking about his book, Mission Drift. He is the co-author, and it is a book that certainly we recommend to you. If you're in leadership, I would certainly recommend this book, but if you're a student of history, as certainly many of us are and really appreciate some of the historical perspective here, you'll appreciate this 200-page book. We have it available on our website, pointofview.net, and also a trailer, which you can watch. It only takes about a minute and a half, gives you a little bit of the history. And Chris, I thought just for a minute, we talked about universities and colleges. Let's talk about seminaries. And I remember, for example, when Paige Patterson left Criswell College and became the president of Southeastern Baptist Seminary, and I came there shortly after he was there, they said they hadn't even had chapel services, and he was really trying at that time to bring it back to orthodoxy, and certainly has, and now he's at Southwestern Baptist Seminary. You have Danny Aiken and some others, but you tell the story in chapter 4 about another individual that we've had on this program before, Al Mohler, and I had always heard that he had a rough time of it, but it wasn't until I read your book that I realized what a tough time he had. But the reason I want to bring this in early on is to recognize that mission drift isn't inevitable. A godly man or woman in a position of leadership oftentimes can bring an organization or a church or a seminary back to orthodoxy. True?
True. It's not the norm, but it is possible. And that story of Al Mohler was one of the most incredible that we read and learned about along the way. And, you know, the dividing principle that we heard again and again from leaders who were able to turn things around was that it is incredibly important that they deal with the hardest things right now. There's a natural human tendency to avoid pain, but leaders who are willing to have courage to stand up for what matters most right now are going to find that it's much better in the long run. And one example, even recently, that's been exciting to hear was once we published the book, we started having leaders from the YMCA across the country reaching out to us and sharing about this movement of returning the sea back into the YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association. And it's this group that's really concerned about the fact that the YMCA has lost sight of its mission. And it's been incredibly encouraging over the course of the past few months to have conversations with their leaders across the country who are saying the YMCA was formed and founded to do more than be a great fitness center. And we as a group of leaders are committing to seeing the YMCA kind of recapture its founding ideals. And that's been incredibly encouraging to both Peter and I, a story of resurgence, really. And the story is still being written. but some exciting things are certainly unfolding there.
I'll have to admit that YMCA is one of those ones where I'd kind of written it off a long time ago, that YMCA might as well just been called the Y. Of course, you talk about the Christian Children's Fund, which is just child fund, and we can talk about the Pew organization in just a minute, and some of them never make their way back. But I thought I'd just illustrate the kind of hostility you can run into sometimes when you try to bring an organization back to its founding, because you tell the story about Al Mohler in his convocation address. Now, put yourself in the position of a 33-year-old individual taking over Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and as he speaks, a number of the students stand up and turn their backs to him. Now, as he walks into the chapel, there is an effigy of him hanging from a tree. This is a level of hostility he faced simply by being appointed as president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. So whatever you might think about his theology or about Southern Baptist theology or whatever, you've got to recognize that if you're going to sometimes change the inevitable drift that seems to take place, there are going to be some that aren't going to want to do that, and that's due to what you call pain avoidance. Sometimes we just want to avoid pain. We want to avoid conflict. I do know some people that get up every morning and look for a fight, but most of us are not of that stripe, and you have to be aware that mission drift is inevitable if you don't take some kind of concrete steps and stands to begin to prevent that from taking place.
One of the folks we interviewed on that point for the book is a gentleman named Fred Smith, who is the executive director of The Gathering. And he had a line that I thought was really, it really captures some of what you just shared. And he said that we have to see our mission like we see our family heirlooms, that even if you can benefit in some ways in the short term by selling them off, you lose something that is so important. And as Christians, we believe that within our organization, the most precious gift we can offer to the world is the hope that comes through a relationship with Jesus. And so as leaders of faith-based organizations, protecting that demands that we make really hard decisions. And I think of InterVarsity, an organization that has lost its right to be on dozens of campuses across this country because of their unwillingness to budge on hiring only Christian students. And you might look at that and say, wow, they're having less of an impact because they're not on as many campuses as they used to be. But InterVarsity's leaders understood that in order to really fulfill their full mission, they needed to have student leaders who are sharing their convictions and values. So they needed to have Christian leaders. And if that meant that they had to leave a campus because student administrators felt like they couldn't be there, that would be a better decision than compromising on the things that matter most.
Wow. And, I've used that example before, oftentimes on our Friday weekend edition. Penedexter, Kelly Shackelford is here. Kelly Shackelford with Liberty Institute. And when he's not with us, we'll have a Jay Seculo or someone else. And we oftentimes have talked about the level of hostility on college campuses that and there have even been court cases that have actually gone against some of these Christian legal society groups and others. And so there is where, again, when the pressure is on, are you going to stand true to your mission, or are you going to compromise? So certainly there's some great illustrations there. And like you said, we are selling off the family heirlooms. We might have some momentary financial gain, but we lose a great deal of our tradition and our history. We're coming up to a break, but I've mentioned Veggie Tales, and almost all of our listeners love Veggie Tales. From time to time, we certainly have had a chance to interview one of the voices on Veggie Tales. But in one of your chapters, Chapter 9, you talk about the kind of the momentary dividing line, because on the one hand, you had what was called Big Idea and the maker of Veggie Tales, but it drifted, and it began, as you explained, when the founder stood up and explained his vision, and then came to find out that the president that had been hired for Veggie Tales really didn't buy into the vision. Explain a little bit more, if you might.
It's almost inconceivable, but in his book, Me, Myself, and Bob, Phil Vischer, the founder of Veggie Tales, describes that very theme. And, in listening to him share his story, there just were a lot of assumptions that he made about the folks that he hired. And I think for faith-based organizations, it's really easy for us to look at someone's candidacy for a job or for a position, in this case, as a senior leader at his company, and easily be wooed by academic credentials, past work experience, proven business results, And in doing so, we can gloss over the thing that's actually more important, and that is, who is this person? And does this person believe fully in the mission? And in the case of VeggieTales, this gentleman was a very accomplished leader, but he didn't really believe in the full mission. And so Phil explains, we're about telling Bible stories to America's children. And he said, well, if that's the mission, I'm out. And I think, I imagine being in that boardroom and saying, how could you be here for this long? I mean, the gentleman was there for years. How could you be here for this long and not know that that's what VeggieTales is all about? I'm not an avid VeggieTales watcher, but having a son who's 3.5, you see it in every single episode. So there were assumptions made along the hiring process, and I think the lesson for leaders is to say, make sure that you're valuing and measuring the things that are most important first.
Well, and I think the point you're making, too, is just think about how it must have been, because in your account, you talk about the fact that after Phil Vischer explains that, and then the president says, well, if that's what it's all about, I need to opt out. And he says, then the room went deathly silent. And, of course, let's finish the rest of the story, because this president hired some other people that didn't have the vision either. I've oftentimes said in a church, if it's misty in the pulpit, it's foggy in the pews. If the pastor is not communicating a clear vision, don't expect the congregation to get it. And, and soon after, Big Idea went bankrupt. And it just illustrates, again, the very dire consequences of not being able to communicate your vision and not being able to stay on task with your vision as well.
That's right. And not many leaders have the courage to share that sort of story, but that Phil Vischer's humility and vulnerability to really come forward with the full story of how VeggieTales collapsed and how the Big Idea went under was really courageous. And to be honest, I think that his story is going to change and impact a lot of organizations and a lot of leaders, because he was willing to say what many weren't willing to say, and that the courageous decisions that he made to share his story will hopefully help others avoid the same fate.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll take some phone calls. Perhaps you have some thoughts or comments. We're going to talk a little bit more about what we can do to shore up these kinds of missions and vision, and also how we as donors, for example, need to be able to ask fundamental questions of churches, Christian organizations, where they're going. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Just joined us talking about this book, which has really been impactful, Mission Drift, written by Peter Greer and Chris Horst with Anna Haggard, and it is published by Bethany House. We have information about it on our website. We have an opportunity for you to order it if you'd like, and we also have the book trailer so you can watch more about it. But if you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this. listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Chris Horst, and again, he serves as the Vice President of Development for Hope International. He is the co-author of this book, Mission Drift, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's take a phone call. We'll go to North Carolina first. Paul, you're on with Chris Horst.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I really appreciate it. I see a shift, not only in these organizations and seminaries, but just across the body of Christ, with, the undermining of the values that many churches are built on. And we have, here in North Carolina, I don't know if you've heard, there's a lawsuit by, I cannot recall the denomination, but they're filing suit against the marriage amendment here in North Carolina that was recently passed, and saying that it's violating their practice of religion, practice of their beliefs, because they believe in performing same-sex ceremonies. I just see a shift across the body of Christ, and I know that biblical illiteracy contributes to the people not standing on Christian principles, and just the undermining of different churches that have gone in that direction of liberalism.
All well said. First of all, it's not surprising some of the churches are drifting, because if the seminaries are drifting, most pastors in churches, there are exceptions, have come through a Bible college or a seminary. So if you begin to lose the orthodoxy there, you can see it. And then, of course, you have just this sort of vibrant secularism that is taking place that challenges Christian belief. And I think it gets back to something I'm going to talk about in a minute with Chris, how the culture eats us for breakfast. And so we have to be really careful with that. So, Paul, I think you are right on target. And it's certainly a matter of prayer, but also a matter of our involvement, both in terms of our time and our energy, but also our money as well, and recognize that there are certain seminaries, certain denominations that are really not worthy of our support because they've strayed from biblical principles. So, Paul, I appreciate you calling in today.
Yes.
Let's get to one of those examples. And Chapter 10, you talk about, and I thought this was appropriate, Chris, since you're the Vice President of Development, follow the money, because a mission true organization partners with donors who believe in their full mission. But before we get to that, let's talk about a negative. I mentioned Andrew Carnegie. I was aware in part about how he probably did fund the secular ideas that we have on the campus. But reading your book, I recognize that one of the most foundational and important principles of the secularization of the universities came because Andrew Carnegie would only give money to universities without church affiliations. And because the dollars were so significant, a lot of those universities and colleges decided to end any kind of denominational tie, any church tie, and thus they hastened with their donor dollars, that is Andrew Carnegie and the Carnegie Foundation, the secularization of the university campuses.
That's right. Yeah, several dozen universities at that time determined that in order to survive, they would cut ties with the denominations that founded them and the folks that were behind them at the beginning in order to take this funding from Carnegie. And it was one accelerant among many pressures that the universities face all the time to drift from their founding ideals. And we talk about money a lot because often when you see these decisions playing out, like an organization changing its name, an organization abandoning their Christian heritage, often, many times, you can trace back the steps, and somewhere along the way, there was a donor or funder who did not believe in the full mission, and in the end, decided that for them to fund the organization, they'd have to attach strings that would redirect or take the organization off mission. And I think your caller, brought up a really wise point in this idea that if leaders are going to withstand the pressures, they have to have a full theological understanding of the work that they do. And we're not just educating students. We are actually, as universities, we are training people up in what it means to be a productive member of society and someone who has rich in character and virtue and contributing to the world in positive ways. And that's a theological conviction. So I think a lot of times the argument is made, well, listen, faith-based organizations shouldn't be in the theology business, but the reality is our theology needs to inform all that we do and how we hire people and the work that we go about. So there is no organization that can operate sort of outside the realm of theology.
Sure. And you, as an individual that interacts with donors, number one, you need to make sure that your donors really understand the mission. But moving from chapter 10 to chapter 11, also you need to, because again, one of the themes that runs through your book, that mission-true organizations track metrics reflective of their full mission. You need to be able to help them show that you are focusing on what is most important, what, as you call, matters most, and being able to give some kind of statistical evaluation so that the
Right.
donor knows that his or her dollars are going to the stated purpose and are making a significant impact.
Well, exactly. And two principles here. First is a lot of what nonprofits, at least, are rated against is our financial performance. And that's the numbers that everyone knows, the overhead percentages, the percent of money going to programs. Those are the primary metrics that nonprofit evaluators and many donors are concerned about. And for a faith-based organization, it can be easy to run our organizations to score positively on those evaluations. And as a faith-based organizations, we know that those metrics will never measure the entirety of the impact that we do. So that's the first principle, is that you have to aim to measure more than just financial performance. And I think the best faith-based organizations do that. But the counterpoint is that you have to be careful not to measure the wrong things when it comes to the impact of the work you're doing. One of the researchers that contributed to the book described a process of going through a bunch of newsletters for missionaries and organizations working in Haiti, and found that in this region of Haiti, the entire population of Haiti had been saved 3 times. So that over the course of his research, they had found that the number of conversions that had been reported, that the whole of this region had been saved 3 times. Now, the reality here is that some of these organizations were not appropriately or correctly counting, because that's not conceivable, that 3 times the number of people living in a place would be saved. So we have to be careful about how we measure as well, that we don't just say, okay, we're going to start tracking the spiritual aspect of our work, and then we somehow get off track and measure the wrong things.
Yes. Second hour today, we're going to be talking with William Pollard. We're going to be talking about leadership principles, but I know one of the ones that surface in your book and his book, interesting enough, is this issue of excellence. I love one of the quotes you have there. Martin Luther says, "A Christian shoemaker does his Christian duty not by putting little crosses on the shoes, but by making good shoes, because God is interested in good craftsmanship." And it does seem to me that in the Church of Jesus Christ, broadly, in churches, Christian organizations, seminary, Bible colleges, and Christians in the secular world, we should be about excellence. And it does seem to me that that's another issue that you raise and is a very significant part of your book, Mission Drift.
It's easy to think that, even in reading the title and the first chapter of the book, an argument could be made, okay, so basically for faith-based organizations to really live out their mission well, they just need to be about evangelizing and sharing the gospel and getting people saved and teaching God's word. And none of those things obviously are bad. However, I've had several instances, including once in Romania when I met with an organization that was doing really poor work. I mean, it was very shoddy. It was a nonprofit that was not achieving its goals whatsoever and not achieving the sort of results that they claimed on their website. And I remember being with them, and the comment that the leader made at the time was, it doesn't really matter how well we do our work. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we just want to see people getting saved. And I think that's, again, a theological misnomer, that God is not concerned with the excellence of our work. And God says, whatever we put our hand to do it with all our strength and do it unto Him. And so as leaders of faith-based organizations, it's just simply unacceptable that a Christian university, for example, would be producing students who are not on par with their peers, or a Christian-led medical facility that didn't have success in making patients better. We as Christians should be leading world-class institutions that are robustly Christ-centered, but also doing really excellent work, regardless of whether it's an inner-city health center a university or an international nonprofit like the one that I work for.
Very good. Some wisdom that comes from the book Mission Drift, and we're going to take another break, and when we come back, we'll take another phone call if we have time, 1-800-351-1212. Talking today with Chris Horst. He is the co-author of the book Mission Drift. Might mention the foreword by Andy Crouch. He's been on the program with us as well, and if you'd like to know more about the book, we have an opportunity for you to order it or also to read about it on our website, pointofview.net. We've posted a video trailer that I would encourage you to watch, and then maybe click on and put it on your Facebook page, hit the share button, or send it to someone so that they know more about this, and also maybe start a conversation about the importance of staying true to mission and doing things with integrity and excellence. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Chris Horst with us for a few more minutes as we talk about the book Mission Drift. And Chris, just a minute ago when we had one of our callers, Paul, talking about, in a sense, how the culture is really moving us, and if we're not careful, we will drift with the culture. One of the chapters which I thought was very important, chapter 13, Culture Eats Strategy for Breakfast, and that is mission true organizations are fanatics about rituals and practices. The problem we have so often in the churches and Christian organizations is say, well, we don't want more liturgy, we don't want more rituals, but there is some value in liturgy or rituals. A good example, even in the so-called secular world, you point out that if you go to a Chick-fil-A, doesn't matter if you go to a Chick-fil-A in Denver or Dallas or Des Moines, you will have the individual say, my pleasure, and they have been taught to do that. You can talk to anybody at FedEx and ask them, what is the mission of FedEx? And they can give it to you. And so there is a sense in which if we want to prevent drift, if we want to do what we can to keep on mission, there is a value in rituals and practices, aren't there?
What seems trivial becomes really significant. And I can attest to my own life that as I practice my faith, as I attend and meet with the body of Christ every week and partake in the Lord's Supper and spend time in God's Word and prayer each morning, it forms me, it shapes me. And we call ourselves creatures of habit, and organizations are just an amplified version of that. They're creatures of shared habits. And mission-true organizations find ways to ritualize what matters most. And one example from a different sort of organization than Hope, but International Justice Mission, which is involved in fighting human trafficking around the world. It's a Christian faith-based organization, and even though they have all this important work to do out in freeing those that are trapped in bondage around the world, they stop every single day for 30 minutes of silence, and they spend that time praying and submitting their work to the Lord, because they know that practice of slowing down and stopping and committing their work to the Lord is the most important 30 minutes a day, because that is what will give them the energy and give them the discernment and the wisdom and the power to conquer the evil forces that are against them around the world. And it's only through the power of God that they can accomplish any good at all. And so it might seem like a waste of time in a sense for an organization like IJM to take 30 minutes from every single employee's time every day to stop in the middle of the workday, but they know that routine, that ritual, is what keeps them grounded.
Yes, man, I've interviewed people with International Justice Mission, including Gary himself, and I never knew that till I read your book. So just a good illustration of some things that at the time may seem small, trivial, maybe even really a little bit annoying, but can keep you on mission. Let's take another phone call. We'll go to Georgia this time. Priscilla, thank you for calling. What would you like to ask?
Thank you. I'd like to ask you a guest. I get a lot of letters, and I've contributed many times over the years to organizations that have little types on the outline outside of the letter, but they never send any a statement at the end of the month or the end of the year. And I have tried to call them, and there's several. And then I have some that even send a penny or a dime, or even a check. Would you consider these legitimate? I've often wondered about it, and maybe I should stop sending.
Okay, great. Chris, you've seen some of those. I've received them as well, whether I have a nickel or a penny to it or a stamp or those kinds of things. Some of that sure strikes a lot of us as gimmicky, and you work in the area of development, so you know that on the one hand, you certainly want to encourage people to give generously, but not under compulsion. But some of it does kind of stray into these areas that strike us all as a little bit overdone and kind of like gimmicks. But what are your thoughts?
Absolutely. Well, I agree with you completely, Kerby. And I think that for me, the big principle here is be prayerful about where you're giving and don't just respond to the squeaky wheel. And a lot of times those that are using either gimmicky mail tactics or phone calls, many times it's a third-party outsourced technology or company that takes a huge percentage of the actual donation. And so my personal conviction, and we don't write about this in the book, but my personal conviction is to pray about what God would have you give to. Obviously, be giving generously to your local church, but then in terms of giving to additional ministries, as a Christian, I want to give to organizations that are overtly Christ-centered and are doing important work that God's placed in my heart. And for my wife and I, that's how we decide our giving, not just based on the mail we receive. And I'm not suggesting that that's what the caller was saying, but broadly, I think that the giving shouldn't be done based on who's knocking on the door the most, but rather about who's doing the best work and who's doing it most consistently in a way that is reflective of your values.
You know, Chris, I'm older than you are, and I can attest to the fact that now it is much easier than it used to be to investigate organizations, because almost every one of these Christian organizations have a website, And that gives you some ideas. Then, of course, now online are what is called a Form 990, which you can use to, number one, determine how much money they raised, how much went to program services. You can see what the individuals actually make who are in positions of leadership. That tells you a great deal, because in the past it was a little easier to pull the wool over the eyes of some individuals and tell you that this particular, and I'm thinking more of the secular organizations, was really raising money for this. And now, of course, there's all sorts of studies that have come out showing that some of these secular organizations, and maybe even a few of the Christian ones, spend a disproportionate amount on advertising, on fundraising, but they don't really fulfill the mission. And so it is much easier in this internet age to find out a lot more and to thus be a much wiser discerner of whether or not you're going to invest your scarce resources in that particular organization.
That's right. And one of the other things that your listeners can check for is consistency. One of the stories we heard in our research was that a couple of organizations have their Christian materials and their secular materials, and they send out different annual reports,
yes,
different newsletters, different letters to their supporters based on their donors' convictions. And for us, we believe that you should be sharing one message.
Yes.
And that message, go to the website and check out. So you receive something in the mail. Does it line up with what you read on their website? Is it the same organization that you feel like you're learning about in the printed materials? So you can check for consistency and just basic financial accountability. The concerning thing about the caller's question, it sounded like, was that she wasn't receiving any sort of notification of whether or not they received her gift, of whether it was a verifiable 501c3 nonprofit organization. Those things are really critical, and any nonprofit that's been around and knows sort of how to operate should be sending out receipt letters consistently. So those are things that you can find online. I mean, the organizations should be listing their 990s on their websites. If they're not, maybe they're smaller or newer organizations, you could ask them. That's a totally legitimate question to ask someone. And if you don't get a response and they're not sending you those financial statements, that would be a major red flag.
I would say so. Chris, you've done a great job today. I appreciate you and Peter writing this book, and I appreciate you giving us an hour today on Point of View. 15 chapters, almost 200 pages of great material that I think would be quite helpful to any person that is in leadership, but also for all of us to learn a little bit more about how to evaluate various charities, churches, Christian organizations. So thank you so much for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate the time you put into preparing for today and really reading through the content. It was a really great discussion, and I'm grateful for your willingness to host me.
Okay. Let me again, just as we're saying goodbye to Chris, and before we get William Pollard in the second hour, once again, in case you just happen to join us, mention that we think very highly of this book, so we've put it in our Point of View store. You can certainly look for it in your local bookstore, and I do encourage you to support your local bookstore. And so if they have this one, it's published by Bethany House, get it there. But if not, we certainly want to put it in your hands because we think it is important for you as a leader to certainly understand these principles, and for all of us as we pray for and support organizations to know a little bit more whether or not this organization stayed true to its mission or whether it's drifted away. We have an article about it, and most importantly, I've also encouraged you to watch the video and then hit the share button, put it on your website or your Facebook page, or send it to someone else that might want to learn a little bit more. All of that is available at our website, pointofview.net. We make it available there so that you can read some of these articles, you can read some of these books, and you can be educated about these issues. Second hour today, I'm going to be talking with William Pollard, a man who I have such respect for, an individual that for many years was the leader of Service Master. We're going to be talking about leadership principles. All that coming up right after this.
Across the nation, this is Point of View. For materials offered during the broadcast, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Today's show is one of the best of Point of View.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
As I mentioned in the first hour, we are privileged to have now with us William Pollard. He is an individual that I quote from quite regularly. Oftentimes when I am speaking on leadership, you can probably be assured that on the screen you're probably going to see a quote from Peter Drucker, maybe John Maxwell. You will always see a quote from William Pollard. More recently, as I was teaching through in my own Sunday school class, Nehemiah, we used a lot of principles there of leadership. And again, lots of quotes from William Pollard. And over the years, I've followed his career. I've known a number of people that have worked with Service Master, heard lots of great stories. And so when I knew that there might be a possibility that we could bring him onto the program today, I was thrilled. First hour today, we talked about mission drift and management. Now we're going to talk about leadership, and these two connect together. He is the founder of Delta One Leadership Institute, chairman of the Fairwind Investment Company, but most importantly, probably best known as having been the chief executive officer, later the chairman of the board, and then chairman emeritus of Service Master, a graduate of Wheaton College, as well as having a law degree from Northwestern University School of Law. Wrote a previous book that you may be familiar with, and certainly one that I would encourage you to get a copy of, Serving Two Masters, Reflection on God and Profit. And his new book we actually have on our website, pointofview.net. It's in our Point of View store if you would like to order a copy of it. The Tides of Life, Learning to Lead and Serve as You Navigate the Currents of Life. William Pollard, just a delight to have you on the program with us today.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you, Kerby.
Well, one of the things I learned early on in your book is the influence of your father. I've known, of course, you were a graduate of Wheaton, and I was certainly have followed your career, but you start the book out talking about the fact that your father was a good teacher, and some of those leadership principles that you've applied in your own life go all the way back to your family of origin.
They sure do, and they're all part of my life, and I was blessed with parents who not only were good parents, but lived faithfully their Christian life. So they were wonderful examples for their children.
Early on, you really had to kind of think through, because of your Christian convictions, how you kind of put your faith and work together. Sadly, as you well know, Mr. Pollard, there are a lot of people that are in the workplace today, and they say, well, my Christianity applies to my church, it maybe applies to my family, but when I get into the boardroom, the courtroom, the newsroom, the classroom, you know, I just really kind of live like the world. But you've made a real conscious effort to make that connection. And again, I think some of that goes back to your family of origin, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It was part of the way my father conducted business. He was a small businessman, but he had a good business, and he felt that he couldn't leave God in the pew on Sunday, but it had to be brought into the way he did his business during the week.
I know when early on in your book you also talk about Peter Drucker and being kind of interested in the model, the business model that you had at Service Master. I guess for just a minute, I know this, but for some of our listeners that maybe are not familiar with Service Master, could you kind of give us an overview of what were some of the corporate responsibilities there? Because I think that would help them understand how you really tried to integrate your faith and work there in that particular area of ministry, which was also your business.
Sure. Well, Service Master was founded by Marion Wade, who was a Christian, and again, he had the desire to bring God into the workplace in a basic service industry.
And as the company grew, it got into a variety of different services. Initially, just cleaning services, carpet, other things. Developed a franchise network, which now exceeds over 5,000 franchisees and is worldwide today. And soon, as the company grew, two other men joined the leadership of the company. That was Ken Hansen and Ken Westner. Again, both Christians, both committed to making a statement and raising the question of God in the marketplace, as well as being a company that could serve customers, generate profit, and create wealth for shareholders.
Sure.
So,
and I might just point out that Ken Hansen was a pastor. So when Marion Wade brought him on, he was a pastor. Of course, later I guess he got an MBA, but which I didn't know until I read your book. But there was really a very conscious effort to really apply biblical principles. And certainly on this program, we've talked about everything from interstate batteries to Chick-fil-A to, of course, right now, one of those issues that's in the news a great deal is, of course, Hobby Lobby and Mardell. And I, in some respects, have always held Service Master out there because going all the way back to Marion Wade and all the way through you, Mr. Pollard, there's always been an attempt to honor Christ and apply biblical principles, which I think is just outstanding. I wish more companies would follow.
Well, it was embedded in our mission and purpose, and it was stated to honor God in all we do, to help people develop, to pursue excellence, and to grow profitably. And those first two objectives were end goals for the company, and the second two were means goals. And one of the things that Mr. Wade determined early on in the business is that this was not just a company to hire Christians. This was a company that would hire the best people for the job, and would be a company that would raise the question of God, but also be inclusive in the sense that it would embrace people in the world that God so loved. And there's a high diversity rate in that world that God so loved. So there was an acceptance of people for what they could accomplish, but at the same time, a challenge for everyone who joined the company as to how they would focus on the development of people in their responsibility, and not just use them as a means or a tool, but in fact recognize that every person has been created in the image of God with dignity and worth and their own fingerprint of potential.
Wow. Let me come back to the first one. I want to give that the second one as well, but the point you made there about excellence, a little bit like a conversation in the first hour where we had this quote from Martin Luther, who said, in a sense, I'm just paraphrasing, we don't honor God. A cobbler does not honor God by putting crosses on shoes, but by actually excellent workmanship. And certainly you had that dedication there of excellence. But I love the second part that you just mentioned as well, and that is, if indeed we do believe that individuals are created in the image of God and have value and dignity, then we should not see people as a means but an end. We should be about developing them and their full potential. So let me come back from the break because I want to spend some more time talking about the tides of life. Might get into that as well. I know you love sailing. We've got to talk about that. I've been sailing a few times myself. And also how to deal with some of the uneven world that we find ourselves in, how to go against the tides. But especially I want to focus some time and attention on this idea of calling. Work is a calling. And those are just a few of the ideas that surface in this book by William Pollard, author of a number of books, The Soul of the Firm. Of course, I mentioned two masters, and we have some information about him and the book on the website. And we also have a nice little video trailer that will give you an overview, and it's something that is on our website, pointofview.net. You can click on that and watch the video, and then you might hit the share button and share it with others, and maybe put it on your Facebook page and use that to let more people know about this book and the conversation we're having today. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with William Pollard, and if you'd like to join the conversation at any point, of course, you are free to do so. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
America's stated military policy has always been to minimize civilian casualties. Last year, the Obama administration even went further by establishing a policy that required near certainty that there would be no civilian casualties before an airstrike takes place. Over the last few months, the U.S. has called upon Israel to follow the same policy. That is why you heard comments from the administration that the Israeli army was not doing enough. As someone traveling to Israel, I appreciate the fact that Israel did so much in the last few months to eliminate some of the threats from Hamas. Alan Dershowitz was on my radio program recently to talk about his new book on the terror tunnels, the case for Israel's just war against Hamas. He also wrote about some of this in his op-ed on the education of a wartime president. Both were a sobering reminder about how Hamas fires rockets from densely populated areas and how they built these terror tunnels so that they could attack Israeli citizens at will. You know, Alan Dershowitz also explained that the Obama administration has begun to exempt itself from its near certainty standard in its fight against ISIS. While it is commendable that the administration wanted to try to meet the higher standard during an attack, the reality in the field suggests that that may not be possible. When Israel is fighting Hamas, they are fully aware that terrorists are using civilians as human shields. They put the Israeli army in a difficult position. Either they attack a legitimate target or they avoid taking out a terrorist threat. The U.S. military sometimes faces a similar dilemma when fighting ISIS fighters embedded in villages. Perhaps the best way to understand how this dilemma plays out is to remember the phrase by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who said, "We use missiles to protect our people. They use people to protect their missiles." We should do all we can to avoid civilian casualties, but we also need to understand the circumstances on the ground. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today William Pollard as we talk about his book, The Tides of Life, Learning to Lead and Serve as You Navigate the Currents of Life. And Mr. Pollard, both in your book as well as in the video that we've posted as well, you talk about the idea of sailing. You love to go sailing, and certainly a sailor has to understand changing sea levels, the difference between spring tides and neap tides, certainly some of the forces that actually work against us, wind. A fair amount of this we can't see, and in leadership, I think you use some good illustrations and analogies and metaphors to help us understand that leadership requires us to sometimes be able to navigate those forces that aren't always predictable and aren't always easy to see.
Exactly, Kerby. In fact, not only in leadership in life, I think we're faced with forces that we can't see, but yet we still have to navigate our life. And in the process of understanding sailing, you realize that sometimes you never can sail against the wind. You always have to use the wind as a vehicle to move forward, whether you're moving forward in tacking back and forth, or in order to get to your end destination. But the real question that I try to raise in the book as well is relating to the analogy to sailing is, as you navigate these choices in life, is there room for God's hand on the tiller?
Yes. And I think you've done a very good job in your own life and even in the book to talk about some of that. Just before we get back into the book, I know you've come back from China, and I'd love to hear what has happened over there. I know that you've had some experience, and I think it would be great for our listeners to maybe hear a little bit about that trip to China and what you've come back with.
Sure. Well, actually, it wasn't a trip to China. It was meeting with Chinese folks here. In fact,
I misunderstood.
I've got a meeting even coming up, a second meeting with a group of Chinese business leaders, Christian Chinese business leaders, who are meeting with a group of Christian American business leaders and just seeking to understand how to integrate their faith with their work. And that's coming up in a week. But last week I was speaking to a group, and there was a group of Chinese in the audience, and they had I provided them my book, and so I just got an email today from them commenting on the book, and they were excited about it. And I'll just read one. He said, I read the entire book and enjoyed it. Not many people can incorporate contextualized quotations from Chairman Mao, Margaret Thatcher, Warren Buffett, and Jesus Christ in one book. So I thought that was
That's a great line. But, let's talk about that for just a minute, because I am more and more encouraged by the number of Christians in China who are getting some positions. Obviously, there's still difficulty for Christians in the workplace and even in the culture of China, but still there is sort of a begrudging maybe acknowledgments, probably a better word, that some of the Chinese leaders recognize that Christians are better workers, more honest, more faithful, and that if they're going to be successful, they can't completely persecute the Christians, because in some respects, those are the potential leaders and the kind of people that you would really want to have in a country that's going to be successful in the 21st century.
That's exactly right. And there's a story about Peter Chow, who is an economist. And back in, maybe 10 years ago, he was sent over here from the senior leadership group of China to investigate how America has been able to sustain the market system for as long as they have. And after spending several months researching, and he came to the conclusion, and at that time he was not a Christian, he came to the conclusion that it was Christian values. And he went back and gave that report to the Central Committee, and then afterwards decided he was going to investigate Christianity more, and ultimately became a Christian. That no doubt has had an influence somewhat, although it's still a country that's under kind of central control as far as how it operates.
My argument has always been that we have a free market system, but if you have a free market system where it's just sort of the survival of the fittest, it has kind of a Darwinian philosophy, that's a dangerous system. But a free market where you have freedom for entrepreneurs to do good, it seems to be a way that you can achieve that only if you have a moral system and a Christian foundation, a Judeo-Christian foundation with a free political system and a free economic system works very well. But when you don't have that, you might be able to survive a little bit with tradition, as you do in Japan or maybe even in China. But the best of all systems are ones where we have checks and balances in our government, we have a free market system, and we have a Judeo-Christian base. And I sort of see it as like three legs on a tripod, and when you only have two of the three, it doesn't work as well. Or when you begin to cut the legs off, as some individuals have done in the political arena or in the religious or spiritual arena, you end up with something that isn't as beneficial to the future of individuals and for their economic development.
Well, all of those are keen observations. I would say that none of us have ever experienced, however, the growth and force of the market system coming out of China today, and it's a new phenomenon in market economics.
Yeah. It certainly is. Just a few minutes while we're talking economics, one of the sections in your book talks about the stewardship of wealth. That's part of where you're talking about the unevenness. But it does seem to me that another aspect of being a Christian in the business world, or even being a Christian, whether you're in ministry or in the business world, seems to me to consider the financial resources God has placed in your hand. And I know that as not only a manager and a leader, but as a philanthropist, you understand how important it is to be a good steward of the financial resources that God has placed in your hands and to use that effectively for His glory.
Yes, Kerby, I believe that I start out with Psalm 24, which basically reminds us that God owns everything. And if I have a talent, if I have a treasure, He owns it. I only possess it, and I possess it to be a good steward. And then I reflect upon what Jesus was teaching in the parable of the talents. And you remember the one steward who didn't invest what he had of the master.
They just buried it. Yes,
buried it, and he was condemned. And in the language of the condemnation, it was, you didn't even put it in the bank for interest. Now, that interest represents a return, a profit. And I believe that God has given us what we have in our life, not to give it back to Him, but He simply wants more. And that's what's required of a steward, is to enhance and multiply the resource they have. And so as part of being a steward, as part of investing in God's work, you, I think, should look at yourself as a partner with the recipient and expect returns, not just financial returns, but more importantly, returns in the lives of people, because in the end, God measures everything with eternal returns. And as we look at our tangible ownership of things, they only have a terminus here in this world, but it's people who will live forever.
That is right. A lot of wisdom that comes from this book, The Tides of Life. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about the idea of work as a calling, maybe some discussion about the awesome responsibility of leadership. And I think you can get a very good idea of some of the things that we will be talking about in the last half hour here, but also it gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the things that are discussed in the book, The Tides of Life, Learning to Lead and Serve as You Navigate in the Currents of Life. And if you are interested in issues like leadership, certainly servant leadership, and stewardship and serving and these kinds of principles of management, we certainly do encourage you to get a copy of the book. We make it available at our website, pointofview.net. But you can also find it in your local bookstore. It is published by Crossway. And go to the bookstore first, see if it's there. But if not, we certainly are making it available because we think it would be a great book for you to have, especially for those of you that find yourself in leadership. And if you think about it, all of us in one way or another are leaders. People are following us, people are watching us, and we certainly can learn some great lessons from William Pollard. And we will come back and we'll also open up the phones in case you have a comment or question. 1-800-351-1212. Lots of information on our website, pointofview.net, including the video that you might want to watch to tell you more about this book and about the life of William Pollard. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this. listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Primarily teaching time, but if we say something that is of interest, you'd like to ask a question, feel free to do so. Otherwise, sit back and learn a little bit more about some of the wisdom that comes from this book, The Tides of Life. And Mr. Pollard, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about your third chapter, Work, a Calling or a Curse. And it seems to me that this is something that we need to recapture in the 21st century, the idea that work is a calling. We, I think, have this sort of sacred secular divide that says, well, if you're a pastor, you're called to the ministry. If you're a missionary, you're called to the mission field. But I would hope that anyone listening, whether they're working in what would be considered a secular occupation or an ecclesiastical occupation, to understand this idea of calling. How would you express that to our listeners?
Boy, I think you've hit it a nail on the head here, Kerby, because I think this is what the Bible instructs us to do, is to look at our work as a calling, as a ministry. One of the things that my friend Billy Graham mentioned a number of times is that the marketplace may be one of the most fertile mission fields in the world. And it is a ministry. And I had the opportunity to engage people that would never darken the door of a church, and to speak about my faith and what it meant to me and running a business and living my life in opportunities that stretched from sweeping the streets in Osaka, Japan, to ringing the bell on the New York Stock Exchange, to speaking in the Great Hall of the People in China, to a janitor's closet in Saudi Arabia. All of those are just examples of the breadth of opportunities as part of bringing your faith and ministry into the work environment for me, because we developed into an international firm serving in 45 countries as well as the U.S., employing or managing over 200,000 people. So we had the opportunity, those of us that were people of faith, to not only live our life of faith, but also to share what it meant to be a follower of Jesus Christ.
Well, and I think there's just an opportunity for you to reach people that a pastor could not reach because you're in the workplace world. I jokingly say that those of us that have any kind of Christian prominence, either we lead people to the Lord or they stay away from us because they know we are. So, after a while, there aren't just as many opportunities as there is sometimes in the world. And as you mentioned just a minute ago, Billy Graham talks about what a fertile place it is to take the gospel into the workplace and to live lives of integrity and character, because I think people are watching us, and it's important for us to be not only with our words, but with our lifestyle, testifying to the truthfulness of the gospel.
That's exactly right. And you mentioned something earlier in the program about excelling in our work. Mr. Wade used to have a pattern. When we were smaller, he could interview all the new employees, and when he found out that the person was a Christian, he'd say, I'm glad you're a Christian, and if anybody comes to me and complains about you sharing your faith in your work, the first question I'm going to ask him is how you're doing your job. If you're doing an excellent job, you're going to give me a second crack at him. If you're not doing an excellent job, you better just keep quiet.
That's right. Don't advertise you're a Christian if indeed you're a bad advertisement for it.
Right. Right.
Can I, along the way, I'd like to take some phone calls. Is that okay with you?
Sure.
We'll go to Arizona first. Keith, you're on with William Pollard.
Hi, William. How are you?
Very
I'm
good.
fine, thanks.
What would you like to share with us?
Well, I just had a comment that I just celebrated my 30th year with one particular company, and I've had a great career, and the Lord's blessed me immensely and given me a ministry on my job, primarily of evangelism, but I've never felt, I know I've been called to the work that I was given, but I never have had an overwhelming passion or desire for the work, but I believe it was what God gave me to do. So just wondered what your comment is, or how you would direct people who aren't necessarily completely passionate about what they do, but it's clear that God wants them to do that particular work. Thank you.
Well, of course, you have to support your family, but I do believe that recovering this kind of biblical concept of calling can make any job, and I'm talking about somebody, I've not always been doing talk shows or being in the ministry. I've worked in a machine shop, and I've laid pipeline, and I've, done all sorts of things over the years. I've been a janitor. I mean, whatever we do, if you're working unto the Lord, and isn't that what 1 Corinthians 10 is all about, that whatever you do, do it all to the glory of God? Sometimes that can create a sense of calling, can't it?
Yes, it can. And, there are aspects about work and different phases of work that are drudgery. There are even aspects of work when you're a CEO and you're faced with a lot of pressures, especially as in my position. We were a public company, and we had a lot of pressures. We were growing very rapidly, doubling in size every 3.5, 4 years, and a lot of expectations from Wall Street on our performance because of the recognition we had received as the number one Fortune 500 company. So there were a lot of pressures in the job, but at the same time, in every job, there are people. We come in contact with people, and when you think of the fact that the person you're coming in contact, no matter at what level of the organization, they have been created in the image and likeness of God. And they have an eternal worth and value. And you have an opportunity to relate to them in the work environment in a way that you can share your faith and make it meaningful. So, that's the calling. That's the mission that I think everyone has an opportunity to have. Not that it's always perfect. You're not always you're gonna make some mistakes at times in life, and that's when you're called to be transparent and admit your mistakes and ask for forgiveness. But it's a great opportunity to be a follower of Jesus Christ in the workplace.
You talk about in your book the idea of the virtue of work and the calling of work. We have to recognize that, yes, their work does involve drudgery because of the fall, and the earth is groaning in travail, to Romans passages and other things like that. But still, we recognize that people were made to work. With Adam and Eve worked in the garden. In the new heaven and the new earth, we will work. Work is something that is valuable, and I think we should be concerned about a society that sometimes values idleness, maybe pays people to not work, pays farmers not to plant. We, I think, as Christians should recognize that there is a meaning to work, and we should applaud that and really emphasize that in this secular culture today.
I think that's true, and again, we have the opportunity to be examples in our work. So it provides a great vehicle to reach out. Again, I come back to John 3:16. It was the world that God so loved. It could have been. He could have phrased it differently, but he didn't limit it to the Jews. He didn't limit it to a particular people. He didn't limit it to evangelical Christians. It's the world that he so loved.
Outstanding. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll chat just for a few more minutes about the book, The Tides of Life. I think you're enjoying and understanding a little bit of some of the principles, biblical principles in there. And of course, we're covering a lot of it very quickly, but we'll come back and talk a little bit about the awesome responsibility of leadership and some of our obligations to serve and what that means and what service means and how we can be servant leaders. And again, if you want more information about the book, we have made a lot of things available to you. First of all, we have the book available. We also, under the articles section, actually have information about the book that you can read, and also some of the endorsements that have been given to the book. We have a web link to the Tides of Life if you wanted to go to that website, thetidesoflife.com. And then we also have a video that you can watch. And again, my instruction to you is to watch it and then to maybe hit the share button and click it so that it can go onto your Facebook page. You can also go to the Point of View Radio Talk Show Facebook page right now, and we have information about that book, and you can use that to click to your Facebook page or to send it to others. This is a good way for you to take some of the things you're learning today and pass it on to others that might benefit from some of the conversation we're having. And we will take a break, come back and talk a little bit more about the awesome responsibility of leadership as we conclude our conversation today with William Pollard. All that coming up right after these messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
To join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Privileged to have with us just for a few more minutes William Pollard as we talk about his book, The Tides of Life, Learning to Lead and Serve as You Navigate the Currents of Life. And again, forward by Billy Graham and certainly endorsed by so many individuals that you would appreciate. And we have information about the book and some of the endorsements and all of that at our website, pointofview.net. Let's go to our phones, and we'll go to McKinley in California. KYCC, thank you for calling today.
Hi, Kerby. William, also, I find that many people in modern times are guilty of squandering and really unwise usage of their funds, because when you consider the billions that are spent on the Halloween costumes and Christmas decorations and Easter bunny and Easter eggs and all of that. And it's really such a waste. And then when you consider the billions that are spent also on buying Christmas trees that are kept for a few days and just burnt, whereas people could make better usage of even the needles if they would save the needles. But there's such a waste, whereas that money could be better combined and used for investments, investing in stocks and buying bitcoins even. And people, if they would combine those, they would have more money to help the homeless if it was more wisely used. What do you think about that?
Well, there's no end. I have found that there's no end of being able to observe what other people could do. But I find that God is holding me responsible for what I do. And that's to be a steward of the resources I have and to wisely invest those in ways which will honor Him. And that's the important thing. Otherwise, I get caught up in either looking at what somebody else is doing that I don't think is right, versus you can get caught up in that, versus just looking at what you're doing with what God has given you.
It seems to me that one of the principles we could apply to our own lives is, if, for example, in 2 Corinthians 4 and 5, Paul kind of talks about, and there are other passages as well, that talks about this idea of having an eternal perspective. And Mr. Pollard, when you look at the world that we're in and begin to apply an eternal perspective, some of the things that seem so important now in light of eternity aren't as important. And I know that you've really thought a great deal about what the stewardship of your wealth, and all of us should think about the stewardship of the financial resources we have and the difference it could make if we did have perspectives that were based upon biblical perspectives and with an eternal perspective.
Very much so. And I often refer to Tolstoy's little pamphlet, How Much Land Does a Man Need? And a story about a Russian peasant who was successful in a small plot of land, bought a bigger piece of land, then bought another bigger piece of land, and then found out that they were having a large pieces of land over in the Urals, and he went over there and discovered that you could buy for a very good price as much land as you could walk around in a day. And so he started out early that morning to walk around a piece of land, and by the time the sun was at noon, he knew he wasn't halfway around, so he started walking faster and faster, and he realized he wasn't going to get to the finish line to make the circumference unless he ran. And 100 yards before the finish line, he fell over and died of a heart attack.
Yeah.
And Tolstoy said, how much land does a man need? Enough for a grave.
That's right. You know, and think of Jesus.
You're not going to take any of these resources with you.
Right.
The only thing that is eternal, again, I come back, is the people you relate to, work with, in your family, your friends. So they're of eternal value.
Right. I was just thinking of the parable that Jesus tells about the man who decided to build bigger barns. You know, how many times you've seen people that say, well, I like my 2,000 square foot house, but I want a 4,000 square foot house, or I want a second house, or I want a boat. Of course, I've always said the two most important days for a boat owner, the day he bought the boat, the day he sold the boat. Right. But, the same kind of illustration. And a lot of that is because we have a culture that feeds materialism and more. And we, I think, as Christians need to live counterculture. And I certainly know that you have done that in your life, and it's a lesson that we can learn from you and apply to our own lives.
Well, thank you. I'm sure there's many more lessons I need to learn. But we were going to talk a little bit about leadership.
Please do.
I'd only mention, Kerby, that the example of Jesus washing his disciples' feet was a powerful example. And the message really there was to his disciples, and his message was, I'm only going to be with you personally for another day or two, and you're going to be leaders of my church. And guess what? It's not going to be about you. They're not going to call you disciples anymore. They're going to call you apostles. And because you were with me, you're going to have a status. But it's not about you. It's about the people that follow. And where are they going? And how are they? Do they know me? And if we would emphasize that more in leadership, we would not only understand more about servant leadership, but as Peter Drucker reminded me, a leader has only one choice to make: to lead or mislead.
Right. And you have as one of your illustrations something I used today, even in one of our devotions, Luke 16. He who is faithful in very little is also going to be faithful in much. And some people right now might say, well, I'm not in much of a leadership position. Well, I think in some respects, be faithful for where God has placed you. But the point I've made more than once, Mr. Pollard, is almost everybody is a leader. You might be a leader in your home. You might be a leader in your community. Many of the listeners I know are leaders because they're business leaders or they're pastors or they're leaders in their Sunday school class. And so leadership is not something just to reserve for you and the other captains of Fortune 500 companies. All of us can learn those leadership principles, and I think one of those key principles is faithfulness. And if we're faithful in the small things, God will bless us and give us more and allow us to lead others, and we should use that with character and integrity, and that's certainly what you talk about in your book.
And it's very important, Kerby, to be continually reminded that you have this awesome responsibility for the people that are following, whether they're children in your family as you're leading in a family environment or whether you're leading in an organization or how you're leading. It's not about you. It's about the people that follow and the direction they're headed. And that's an awesome responsibility for a leader.
Well, again, I might just apologize. I didn't get to all the phone calls today, but that is something we can cover in a future conversation. But if you've joined us, we are talking about the book, The Tides of Life. And I might just mention for just a minute, Mr. Pollard, that we do have a link to thetidesoflife.com. That is a place where people can order the book, download a sample chapter, get in discussion with you, and even find some of your other books, and also find out more about the Delta One Leadership Institute. So those are all resources we would commend to people, and I appreciate you taking the time not only to write such a great book, but also giving us a time today for an hour here on Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby. Thanks for this opportunity, and for those who are listening. Thanks for listening.
We appreciate that. Let's, if we can, just encourage you to go to some of the resources we've been making available today. We have both books from the 2 hours available. So if you would like to know more about Mission Drift, that book is available. The Tides of Life, that book is also available. We have videos that go with both of those books. So let me encourage you to take the time to watch those. We have articles that relate to both of those issues, and then we have some of the links that I mentioned there as well. So if you wanted to engage in a conversation with William Pollard, there is a contact element there, and there's a way in which you can interact with him. There is also, of course, a way in which you can order the book or maybe just download a chapter and decide if that's what you would like. So it's all available at that web link under the Tides of Life, and it's all available at the website pointofview.net. Just before we say goodbye, let me mention that we do give you an opportunity to get involved with us. We have a button there that allows you to give us your email, and then you can decide if you'd like to receive my daily commentary, the show threads, or other resources. We like to send those to you so that even when you're not listening to this program, you have all of the information we've talked about. And we also, of course, have a button that says donate. That's a way in which you can support this ministry. Well, we greatly appreciate your financial gifts. I want to thank Andrew and Catherine for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
You have been listening to Point of View. For materials offered on the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30. Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221, or call our toll-free number 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.